In 2006, I happened completely by chance to sit next to Richard Ford on a train to Manchester. Unbelievable. Of all the train carriages and all the trains in all the world, and I happened to sit next to arguably America's greatest living writer. I said, "Mr. Ford, sir, why are you going to Manchester?" And he told me he was going to promote the third instalment in the Frank Bascombe series. Now, I knew that the second instalment, Independence Day, was the first novel to ever win the Pulitzer Prize and the PEN/Faulkner Award. I knew that, and he told me he was going to Manchester to promote the third instalment, and I said, "Is it any good?" And he laughed, and then he thought, and then he said, "I don't know, you tell me." And he gave me the copy he was going to read from, and it's still it's one of my most cherished possessions. So it's a wonderful book. Train eventually arrived in Manchester. I ran out onto the platform. I said, "Mr. Ford, sir?" He said, "Yep." I said, "Do you know, maybe when you finish your reading, you might want somebody to, show you around Manchester. I'd be happy to." He said, "Well, that sure is kind, but I guess by that time we'll be pretty tired, so we'll probably just head home and hit the hay. But it sure has been real nice to meet you. You take care now." He started walking off in the direction of the taxi rank. I ran after him. I said, "Mr. Ford, sir, Mr. Richard Ford, sir?" He said, "Yep." I said, "Mr. Ford, sir, you know, I do a wee bit of writing myself, actually." He said, "Oh, well, that is swell. Well, good luck with that. You take care now." He had his hand on the taxi trying to get in. I said, "Mr. Ford, sir, Mr. Richard Ford, sir?" He said, "Yeah, what is it?" I said, "Mr. Ford, sir, I thought maybe I could send you some of my stuff sometime." He said, "Well, yeah, okay, you do that. That's great. You take care now." He got in the taxi, drove off. I said, "Mr. Ford, sir, I don't have your address." But he was gone, off, out of my life forever. But I'm glad to still have his words. He's a wonderful writer. Here's the opening sentence from Independence Day. "In Haddam, summer floats over 3 softened streets like a sweet lotion balm from a careless, languorous god, and the world falls in tune with its own mysterious anthems." Wow! Richard Ford! Richard Ford can write that, but so can his narrator Frank, because the story goes, although Frank is now a real estate agent, he used to be a sports writer and a novelist. So Frank Bascombe's a character who's got the same education as Richard Ford. He's also a similar age, he's the same gender, same race, same nationality, same class. So Richard Ford's able to write as Frank Bascombe without sacrificing his own language. And in fact, it's amazing when you look at first-person narratives, how many of them are narrated by characters who happen to be authors or journalists or PhD students in English literature, or some other person who's able to share the author's language. So that's one type of first-person narrator, guys like Frank Bascombe or Philip Roth's Nathan Zuckerman. But what happens if your protagonist is an 8-year-old girl, say, or a man who's suffering from Alzheimer's, or a semi-literate former prisoner, or a Chinese immigrant to London whose first language is Mandarin, or indeed any of the other billions of people who haven't spent their lives reading and writing in English? Well, if you're going to use one of those characters as a first-person narrator, then the chances are you're going to have to make a huge sacrifice. You're going to have to abandon your own writing, your own language, your own idiosyncrasies, your own expressions, perhaps your own wit, and you're going to have to hide your own ideas and values, because every word you write is going to have to come through the voice of this other person. I always think that writers, when they are deciding on their point of view, should think of themselves like Tommy Johnson at the Crossroads. You know the story of Tommy Johnson, the great blues singer. The story goes he's walking at the crossroads and he meets the devil. And he gives the devil his guitar, and the devil tunes his guitar and gives it back. Tommy Johnson's able to play music the like of which nobody has ever heard before. But he sold his soul to the devil. and he's paid a terrible price for his skill. And writing in the first person is kind of like that. You can do amazing things in the first person, but unless the narrator is very similar to yourself, you have to sell your soul, because everything you write can't be your own ideas, can't be your own language. It has to belong to the narrator. As I say, you can do wonderful things in the first person. Here's an example from Irvine Welsh's Train Spotting. Mother Superior was Johnny Swan, also Kent as a White Swan, a dealer who was based in Tollcross and covered the Sighthill and Wester Hale schemes. I preferred to score frae Swanee or his sidekick Ramey, rather than Seeker in the Moorhouse Leith mob, if I could likes. Better gear usually. Johnny Swan had once been a good mate of mine. Back in the old days we played football together for Porty Thistle. Now he's a dealer. I mind him saying to us once, no friends in this game, just associates can. In Train Spotting, the sacrifice is definitely worth it. But how many times do I read a story in which I critique the use of language because it's not very precise, it's not very interesting, and the author says to me, well, but it's realistic because it's a first person narrator, and that is how that character would really narrate. For instance, he might say, look, I've written it as this character's Facebook page, and that is how she would actually write on her Facebook page. Something like, Soz, not been in touch everyone, things really busy with assignments and drinking, lol. Me and Steve just broke up, you've probably heard, basically because we decided we just wanted different things, or deaf going to try and stay friends. Now this may be realistic, but it's not interesting. There's a million billion such words floating around in cyberspace, and in this case it doesn't justify sacrificing precision of expression and standard rules of grammar and language use. So I reckon that before you decide to use a first person point of view, you should go through a wee checklist that goes something like this. The first question you've got to ask yourself is the narrator sufficiently skilled, eloquent and similar to yourself that you can write interestingly in her voice without compromising or altering your language? And if the answer to that is yes, go for it, great. But if the answer is no, then you need to consider a second question. Are the narrator's language and worldview sufficiently interesting, different, powerful and integral to the story that they justify abandoning your own way of writing? And if the answer to that is no, then stop. Use a different point of view. Write it in the third person subjective. But if the answer is yes, then there's a third question you've got to answer. Are you knowledgeable enough to convincingly write as this character? Do you have the ventriloquist skills to impersonate his voice? Can you efface yourself? And if the answer to all those questions is yes, great, go for it. But if the answer to any of them is no, then stop. Choose a different point of view. Maybe try the third person subjective. Thanks a lot for watching, and good luck with your writing.